Hi to all. Okay, can I start already?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So good morning, afternoon, or night to some. My talk of today will be about the Portuguese community of Hamburg, which has traditionally has received less attention by historians. And I thank David and Ton for allowing this talk to take place with their very kind invitement. And so yes, so the Portuguese nation of Hamburg was one of the three communities of the Western Sephardic diaspora. This was the topic of my thesis that was defended in 2018. So this thesis developed into a book which was published this year, last month. And so the book is a rearranged version of that thesis, and it's mostly about the social, institutional side of the community. As the main sources for this book, I chose the two protocol books of the community of Hamburg. Which were made in the 17th century. So these protocol books span the period that goes from 1652 to 1682, so 30 years. And they, like all protocol books, normally they tell about the institutional life of the community, the religious life of the community. And it seemed to be a good starting point to know a little bit more about this community from which we have so less information. So just a little detail, a little note before I start. The book was published by an Italian university publisher, which only sells inside of Italy, which is a problem for the people interested in buying the book. This is why, for anyone that is interested in buying the book, you can speak with me directly. I will write my personal email here in the chat box, and you can contact me to buy the book. Okay, so I will just write it here now. Okay, for everyone to see, and you can always contact me if you want to buy the book. Okay, so so among some of the major contributions to the history of the Sephardic community in Hamburg, we find by chronological order the works of Hermann Kellenbenz, Michael Studmund Halevi, and Joachim Whaley. Also Jordan Potring. So separated by a few decades, these seminal works provided deep and broad knowledge on a wide range of fields regarding the Jewish life in Hamburg, namely transregional economic networks, communal institutions and social dynamics, intellectual and cultural interactions, and finally issues of identity, perception, and memory. Notwithstanding the undeniable contribution of German historiography to the knowledge about the Sephardim of Hamburg, there is nevertheless an important aspect shared by most of the works mentioned so far, namely the almost exclusive focus on Christian sources to the detriment of those left by the community itself. So in fact, with the possible exception of the works published by Studmund Halevi and Cassuto, in-depth researches based on the sources produced by the community itself, both protocol and literary, were relatively rare and piecemeal. Most of the studies published in this area, apart from those already mentioned above, being due to the invaluable contributions of Joseph Kaplan, Benzion Ornan Pincus, Marianne and Ramon Saraga, Salomon and Leoni, and Julia Lieberman. Although the small corpus of documents left behind by the Portuguese of Hamburg does not invite at first sight the attention typically devoted to other communities of the Portuguese nation, there are several compelling reasons for an academic reappraisal of the sources produced by the Hamburg community. The first of which concerns the fact that, as already mentioned, almost all research on the subject has so far largely ignored the wealth of community sources. The second is that of the small group of researchers that have actually looked at the communal sources, only a minority have relied on the original Portuguese manuscripts, and research has focused mainly on the incomplete German translations edited by Isaac Cassuto. In fact, and despite the obvious limitations of the German version, marked by a lack of scientific rigor and the incomplete transcription of the original, it has been the reference for a considerable number of studies dealing with the Portuguese community of Hamburg in the last decades, with special consideration for German historiography. In itself, this fact should serve as an invitation to the historical exploration of the original, largely ignored compared with the analogous documentation existing in other Portuguese communities, such as London or Amsterdam. It is partly this important gap, motivated by the language barrier, that the present book seeks to fill by proposing an historical re-examination of the important source of the Portuguese community of Hamburg. So I start my book with the in-depth analysis of the social structures that characterize this community, that is, the legal, political, and hierarchical framework of the community over the considered period. In particular, the composition and function of communal leadership, as well as the evolution of its election process and the developments characterizing the period of political centralization. I then proceed to analyze the community's financial administration in the 17th century, in particular, its revenue, expenditure, and tax policy, as well as the evolution of the community's financial situation, both in the short and long term, the duties, functions, and background of the various civil servants hired by the community, and the itinerary of their presence in the community was studied taking into account their impacts on congregational life, their relationship with communal leadership, as well as their family, the family background of some of these families who came to constitute the institutional, religious, and educational body of the Portuguese community of Hamburg. Among the 40 or so individuals who served the Mahamad of the Portuguese community of Hamburg during the period from 1652 to 1682, the influential and wealthy Portuguese merchant are the influential and wealthy Portuguese merchant Isaac Senhor Teixeira, who stands out in the foreground with 14 appointments, 9 as deputy. So appointments for leader of the community. This is for the Mahamad as Parnasim. He's followed by the physician Dr. Isaac Pimentel with 12 appointments, 8 as deputy, and by Salomon Cohen with 10 appointments, 4 as deputy. Immediately following are Salomon Curiel with 9 appointments, 1 as deputy, the physician Dr. Baruch Namias with 8 appointments, the influential merchant Isaac Nunes Henriques with 7 appointments, Joseph Francês, 6 appointments, Joseph Yesurun, 6 appointments, and David Curiel with also 6 appointments, brother of the above mentioned Salomon Curiel. Statistically, the Curiel family appears in first place with the 3 members of the clan, David, Jacob, and Salomon Curiel, leading the community a total of 19 times during the 30 years considered. In second place comes the Teixeira family with father and son, Isaac and Abraham Teixeira, sharing the leadership of the community a total of 17 times. Undoubtedly, these were by far the 2 most important clans in the Portuguese community of Hamburg, playing a key role in the religious, social, and political conduct of the community for the specified time. Among other important clans who assume a leading role in the conduct of congregational affairs is the notable family of doctors, the Namias de Castro, with the two brothers Isaac and Baruch Namias de Castro serving a total of 11 times in the Mahamad. The Nuns Henriques followed a family of influential merchants with a total of 9 elections to the post. These were shared between Isaac and Moshe Nuns Henriques, especially in the last decade. Other families were notable for having only one of their members serving repeatedly in the Mahamad. This group includes some of those mentioned above, Pimentel, Francisco, Cohen, and Yesurun, as well as other families with less representation in the Mahamad. The Guedes, the Levi Ximenes, the Baruch, and the Abendana Mendes. It is also during this period that several of the individuals mentioned exert a vast and profound influence on European politics as diplomatic agents, correspondents, and international bankers. Among the most notable are Duarte Nunes da Costa, agent of the Portuguese crown from 1644, and Jacob Rosales, resident of Spain in Hamburg during the 1640s and 1650s. Both would play diametrically opposed roles during the War of Restoration, the Portuguese War of Restoration, serving for several decades as key pieces in the war effort of both countries. So both countries, in this case, Portugal and Spain, providing gunpowder, war, tar, ships, and even soldiers in some occasions. Duarte Nunes da Costa would even play a leading role in the creation of the Companhia Geral do Comércio do Brasil, providing it with some of the first ships and war armaments. The leading role played by Jews from Hamburg during this particularly troubled phase in international politics was not confined to the countries of the Iberian Peninsula. Diego Teixeira, by far the richest and most important member of the Portuguese community, attracted the attention of various monarchs and princes of his time, becoming a financier for the Danish crown and the court of Holstein-Gottorp, carrying out financial transactions for the Habsburgs and managing the capital of Queen Christina of Sweden. Although excluded from the outset from certain sectors of the local economy, protected by corporations or from investing in real estate, the impact of Portuguese presence in Hamburg was particularly noticeable in the creation of the city's first bank in 1619, or in the thriving areas of international finance, such as capital investment, stock market, trading and speculation, bills of exchange, marine insurance, and bond and commodities trading. In the next chapter of the book, I analyzed the community's religious, educational, and legal institutions, namely the synagogue, the primary schools, or Talmud Torah, and the teachers of the community, the ritual slaughterhouse, the ritual bath, the houses of advanced study, yeshivas, and yeshivot, and finally the system of communal justice, both rabbinical and lay. In methodological terms, I attempted to take a synchronic and diachronic approach to the object of study, meaning I attempted to analyze these institutions both in the context of their statutory frameworks and their historical development over the 30 years considered. Central to this research was the identification of the main challenges, expectations, and problems, highlighting the evolution of these communal institutions and the often antagonistic roles assumed by their main actors in the exercise of their functions. Important characteristics distinguish the educational experience offered in Hamburg from that of other centers of the Portuguese diaspora, in particular, Amsterdam. Firstly, as already seen above, education in Hamburg was underfunded and understaffed, a situation that becomes evident from the many references to overcrowded classes and teachers overloaded with multiple educational activities. Secondly, facilities and resources were far from ideal, a situation that was due not only to the lack of an Etz Chaim style public library as in Amsterdam, but also to the impact of the extreme vigilance exercised by the Lutheran Church and its effects on the suppression of religious activity. Thirdly, the delicate political situation in Hamburg, marked by tense relations with the local population and the precarious collective existence, may have served as one of the main causes of its poor attractiveness as a center of religious formation and activity. Taken together, such facts would help explain, along with the internal problems of the community, the poor supply of teachers, their seniority and lesser preparation, as well as apparently their limited impact in terms of education in the students. Finally, three characteristics which relate to the educational practice illustrate the paradoxes and challenges of the teaching experience in Hamburg. The inclusion of Tudescos as beneficiaries of primary education, of Portuguese Jewish primary education, and even on one occasion, local students of Christian faith. The lowering of admission standards for entry into congregational education, and finally, the conflicts concerning the pedagogical orientation between the community leadership and the teaching staff, composed mainly of the families Palache, Israel, and Meatop, all of which with strong links to North African Jewry. The importance of these events in the definition of the educational system in Hamburg cannot be emphasized enough, since they would represent, each in its own way, a severe blow to the self-perception of distinction and integrity that epitomize the ideal of the Portuguese educational model. Thus, unlike the success story that was Amsterdam, Hamburg was only able to maintain its relevance in terms of education at great cost, confirming in this case a profound discrepancy between the ideal and the reality. In what concerns cultural life, while the literary production of the Portuguese community of Hamburg never rivaled that of its counterpart in Amsterdam, it nevertheless reflected the rich and varied intellectual creativity of some of its most notable exponents. This fact, together with the circulation achieved by many of these works, is all the more remarkable if we take into account the effects of rabbinical and Lutheran censorship in the suppression of literary expression. In fact, this period allowed a substantial cultural life to flourish, one reflected in the high number of works published and the constitution of private libraries of international renown. The collection of the teacher and scholar Samuel Abash, which is a subject of an article by Michael Stubmund-Halevi, had, for example, more than 1,100 titles in 8 different languages, covering a variety of literary genres and themes representative not only of contemporary Iberian culture, but also of the main scientific and theological debates of the time. Among some of the most prominent authors from the community were the rabbi and poet Moses Gideon Abudiente, who published the Hebrew grammar in Portuguese in 1633. In 1666, at the height of the Sabbatianic Messianic favor, another of his works entitled Fim de los Dias was censored by the leaders of the Portuguese congregation for fear of its impacts on the local Christian population. Other men of letters include the aforementioned Jacob Rosales, whose Portuguese name was Manuel Bucar Francês, who, in addition to his penchant for mysticism and the occult, would publish works in fields as diverse as mathematics, astronomy, and the natural sciences. His best-known poetic work is perhaps the one published in Portugal in 1624, entitled Anas Faliosas da Monarquia Lusitana, a political and literary exaltation of Sebastianism, in which the restoration of the future of the Portuguese kingdom would correspond to a new golden age of universal history. The religious history of the community of Hamburg also offers important distinctions in comparison with its counterpart in Amsterdam. A smaller and less rigid bureaucracy meant less rigidity in the roles assumed by the parties and greater institutional flexibility to transfer rights, duties, and authority according to the opportunity of the moment. Although the Mahamad's power was theoretically absolute and uncontested, the evolution of communal institutes unequivocally demonstrates the way in which power relations were negotiated or even occasionally contested by the Achamim, by the rabbis. Thus, in a period especially hit by a wave of violence, the Mahamad accepts without much resistance a demand from the rabbis for more legal power, giving them veto rights over matters of cherem. In another case, the Achamim openly confronts the Mahamad's jurisdictional authority by sending an independent commission to the German Tedesco community of Hamburg and openly questioning the leadership of the Portuguese community. This delicate situation almost caused an institutional deadlock, delaying the rabbis from their duties in the Bet Din and their responsibilities in the synagogal and educational service. Such facts demonstrate how the plasticity of power relations between, on the one hand, the secular government, and on the other, the religious leadership, was defined not only by the degree of authority and influence, but also in the nature of the socio-economic conjuncture in question, challenging preconceived ideas of a total and unwavering supremacy of the Mahamad vis-à-vis the religious leadership. This is particularly noticeable during the Sabbationist fervor that gripped the community between 1665 and 1666, and in the strong religious influence that and in strong religious influence that the latter would provide for the rabbis, all of which apparently in perfect harmony with the expectations of the community's secular leadership during the period. The following chapter of the books deals with the justice system of the Portuguese community of Hamburg and its insertion in the jurisdictional framework of Hamburg. By focusing on the legal history of the Portuguese Jewish community of Hamburg, I was able to analyze how Portuguese communal justice worked side by side with the state justice of Hamburg and the jurisdictions of both the Holy Roman Empire and the Danish Kingdom. This happened because the legal proceedings involving members of the Portuguese nation were, on the one hand, made up by Portuguese and Spanish businessmen, and on the other, by merchants of the various religious communities in Hamburg, such as the French Huguenots, the English merchant adventurers, the German Lutherans, and the Dutch Calvinists. This comparative analysis allowed the uncovering of some central questions, such as how was justice administered within the Portuguese community of Hamburg? What were the main threats to its authority? How did Portuguese communal justice work side by side with local and regional justice? And to what extent did external legal bodies affect the political, economic, and social life of the community? A major question in this regard was to understand the role played by the phenomenon of legal pluralism, and more importantly, its effect on social and religious practice. In this respect, important work has been done lately by historians Evelyn Oliel-Graus and Alex Kerner on the justice system of the communities of Amsterdam and London, respectively. This work allows the discovery of particularities in what otherwise appears to be a justice system characterized by some common broad features, from its historical Iberian heritage to its general functioning. As far as the case of Hamburg is concerned, the implementation of the Portuguese Jewish legal model in Hamburg was characterized by a constant and seamless interaction with the local jurisdictional fabric. What I mean by this is that, to all intents and purposes, the Portuguese justice system functioned as a court of first instance for the Portuguese members, of course, with its decisions being considered legally binding by the local courts of the Niedergericht and Obergericht. So these were the two courts of Hamburg. The Portuguese court, or the Portuguese legal system, could even go so far as to judge some cases according to local law and customs, the so-called law of the land, or in Portuguese, lei da terra, instead of those of the community, as shown repeatedly by communal sources. This state of affairs demands a complete reassessment of the previous literature on the subject, demonstrating a level of integration never before imagined, and therefore quite interesting in terms of the possibilities that further research could reveal. I then focused my attention on the political history of the community during the tumultuous process of congregational unification that spanned the years from 1650 to 1680 roughly. The intense conflicts that arose in this transition period should be understood not only in the context of a long maturation and independence achieved by the four congregations, but also and primarily as efforts to resist assimilation through renouncing family and religious identities. These issues and the ideological polarization that cemented the formation of two opposing camps. The Milano and the Lima families, backed by a substantial portion of the community who were in favor of a more democratic political process, and on the other hand, a small number of influential individuals and families who favored an oligarchic electoral process, such as the Curial and the Teixeiras. The success of the former, although temporary, is undoubtedly remarkable. The democratization that marked the electoral process of the Hamburg community, and that was in force for 15 years, from 1662 to 1677, was a novelty in the Portuguese communities of the Western Sephardic diaspora. If we consider all the other cases, namely in London, Amsterdam, Livorno, and Bordeaux, the election process in these communities after the corresponding unification agreements was traditionally carried out by co-optation, with the oligarchic regime becoming the immutable rule throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Therefore, as granting considerable rights to the community's heads of household, the precedent set in Hamburg created a new paradigm of governance that challenged the very structures of secular and religious authority on which the Western Sephardic communities were based. The research done in this chapter allowed, on the other hand, to unveil the formation of a fourth congregation called Magen David, which for some reason was ignored or went undetected by previous studies, possibly due to its small dimension or time of existence. The research also made it possible to discover the main families belonging to each of the congregations before the unification of 1652. Thus, we know that congregation Magen David was constituted by the Lima family, by the Lima, Abudiente, and Pereira families. The Neve Shalom congregation represented some of the wealthiest members of the community, consisting of the Curial and the Teixeiras, and also the Baruch Isidro. The Talmud Torah congregation was composed by the pioneering Namias de Castro family, and finally the Keter Torah by the likes of the Milano and the Rosales. The following chapter or topic I analyze in my book analyze social assistance and charitable institutions. For that chapter, I studied the key social institutions of the community, such as the Hebra, the Gemilut Hasadim, and the Etz Haim School for the Poor. In particular, the nature, scope, and action of each of these institutions was examined against the backdrop of other models of communal assistance in the Portuguese diaspora. I placed particular emphasis on the contributions of the charity box and other welfare benefits, in particular travels, marriage, and loan allowances, as well as on the assistance provided by the community to outside individuals or entities such as foreigners, captives, and communities in distress. In a community strongly affected by the specter of poverty, such as Hamburg, much more so than in Amsterdam, benevolent societies initially presented themselves as one of the most beneficial investments in promoting social cohesion. Their religious and humanitarian purposes not only opened the possibility for a legitimate form of social occupation, providing an alternative space for individual involvement and achievement, but also, and perhaps more importantly, a vital nucleus of socialization operating across diverse ages, socioeconomic strata, and political influence. However, what can be observed in Hamburg over the 30 years under consideration is that, far from serving as a stage for the fruitful development of this type of initiative, private and mutual societies hardly existed during the period. And the few that were allowed to maintain a significant level of independence, such as the Etz Chaim, so in this case, it's a school for the poor. I should stress that Etz Chaim in Hamburg is not the library. So these few institutions, such as the Etz Chaim, which were allowed to maintain a significant level of independence, were obliged to partially or fully renounce their autonomy. The almost non-existence of benevolent societies of an autonomous character in Hamburg points not only to the structural limitations of the community, reduced financial possibility of its members, low population, reduced middle class, but also and above all to the highly centralizing and monopolizing policies conducted by the Mahamad during the period. Although other communities have been marked by the same dilemma, characterized by the need to grant, on the one hand, a certain degree of religious autonomy, and on the same time to supervise and control the activity of these societies, the Hamburg community has taken a more radical approach than its counterparts. As part of their repressive policy towards dissent, all forms of sub-congregational organization involving a certain level of autonomy were viewed with suspicion by the community leadership and at one time or another actively pursued and discouraged. Thus, unlike Amsterdam, where alongside the central government, numerous private institutions were instrumental in creating a fabric of interdependence and social solidarity, in Hamburg, the aversion of the central government to autonomous initiative created a vacuum. And this vacuum was increasingly difficult to fill and even more so to finance. Unparalleled in any other community in the Portuguese diaspora, this aversion to decentralization may be closely related, on the one hand, to the serious internal conflicts that marked much of the community's history in the second half of the 17th century. On the other hand, the precarious political and legal situation of the community, dependent on the delicate balance of power between the Senate and the Bürgerschaft, has certainly had a considerable impact on its level of self-confidence, leading its leaders to compensate the deep instability through a more pronounced and intransigent internal position. So finally, in the last part of the book, I address the questions of morality, discipline, and transgression. And inside the topic of transgression, I also address the situation of women in the community. Although the protocol books have little to say about certain areas of communal life, namely, for example, the daily vicissitudes of going about one's professional and cultural life, they nevertheless contain a wealth of extremely valuable information about how discipline and orthodoxy were maintained within the community. Through the records of transgressions, it was possible to identify a large number of factors inherent in the social, religious, and political life of the community over the 30 years considered, such as, namely, how did communal leadership maintain and discipline within the community? What coercive instruments were at its disposal for that effect? How did policies concerning social discipline evolve? And how did they reflect important notions about the community over the period under review? In addition to the common instances of transgressions traditionally practiced in the various communities of the Portuguese nation, I sought to reveal the other more specific cases that were to some extent peculiar to the community. This analysis covered the various types of crimes committed, their frequency, as well as the disciplinary response of communal authorities to the violation of communal bylaws. My research also focused on the role of women as agents and targets of transgressive behavior, and disciplinary practices. respectively, in order to understand what these cases reveal about the attitudes and perceptions of the ruling class about women and their condition in the Portuguese Jewish communities of the Western Sephardic diaspora. Building on the recent studies by Melamed, René Levin-Melamed, Jessica Hoytman, Lieberman, and Brunel, and on the analysis of the ledgers of the Portuguese community in Hamburg, my research demonstrated that gender did in fact play an important role in the prosecution and punishment of transgressive behavior in the Sephardic community of Hamburg. As shown through the analysis of various cases presented, not only were decisions based on the sex of the transgressors, but gender also constituted a key criterion for determining the guilt of the transgressor, the type of the punishment attributed, and its level of severity. The fact that gender affected the nature of the punishment that was given in itself was significant. However, the fact that it was very much at the forefront of the Mahamat's decision obliges historians to completely reconsider early modern Sephardic perceptions on gender beyond the restricted scope of transgression and punishment. The fact that women were rarely held accountable for their transgressions, especially when compared to their male counterparts, reveals a reluctance that pervaded the attitudes of the Mahamat when judging such matters, and that was based upon two more or less clear assumptions. On the one hand, it derived from the nature of the communal organization and its social-political constraints. That is, the widespread assumption that the community statutes were addressed expressly towards men in their conception, observance, and supervisory responsibility, and that as a consequence, the culpability of women was reduced, so as it was also considered that women were far less likely to commit transgressions or to have the capacity to understand the statutes themselves. This situation is demonstrated by the conciliatory and often condescending tone used by Portuguese Mahamat, demonstrating a patronizing attitude towards women in general. Secondly, such attitudes were based on sex. In principle, women were less likely to be incriminated due to the very fact that they were women, as clearly stated by the Mahamat itself on one occasion. Lying at the origin of this mindset was a distinction conceived by the Portuguese leadership, which viewed women as less suited to receiving punishment and considered punishment itself as something that ought not to be applied to women. Therefore, not only was there leniency towards female punishment in general, but when it was applied, the penalty was often less severe than that given to men. On the other hand, despite the relative unaccountability in the case of cases of deviant behavior, women were not reluctant to demand what they considered to be their rights. Women could still make use of the community's leaders to enhance their position within the domestic sphere, whether by receiving their support for a stable and orderly marital life, or in defending themselves against cases of domestic violence and impending threats by their husbands. Whereas disagreements and aggressive behavior seem to have been quite normal features among men, women showed a remarkable tendency for cooperation, negotiation, and even for manipulation, qualities that almost certainly compensated for their inferior social status, broadening the range of options available to them in their dealings with the Mahamat. It would be instructive at this point to compare the attitudes of the ruling elite towards women during the first years of the community's existence, a period in which the emergence of public institutions caused the transfer of crypto-Jewish female prerogatives to the domain of male and public authority. Given the practical impossibility of assessing this information in the case of Hamburg, its relevance is nonetheless remains as crucial as ever, especially given the specific circumstances surrounding gender power relations in Sephardic history at that particular time. Returning to the more general topic of communal discipline, it has been shown how during the period between 1652 and 1682, the levels of transgressive behavior reached particularly high values in the Portuguese community, especially if taken in consideration the values already known for the community of Amsterdam. Considering its smaller size, the high number of expulsions, and the high propensity for deviant behavior, such data attests to a certain extent the unstable foundations on which the community's master pillars were built. On the one hand, the impressive number of expulsions primarily reflect two fundamental aspects of the Hamburg community during the period. The first one is a tense and political social atmosphere marked by a high rate of transgressive behavior. And the second is a disciplinary attitude tending to be severe and in some cases extreme, adopted by the community authorities in response to growing social unrest. As already mentioned, more than phenomena of organized resistance, criminal records make it possible to detect periods of crisis and erosion in the main organs of power. In this respect, the outbreak of deviant behavior in the late 1660s and particularly during the years 1670s and to 1680 seem to be closely related to the social and economic problems resulting from the Sabbatean disillusionment and the sudden collapse of social cohesion and institutional authority that followed it. This seems to be corroborated by a drastic increase in the number of serious offenses during this period and almost simultaneously the tightening of disciplinary policy by the communal authorities. In any case, the difficulty in dealing with the growing number of transgressions would lead the Portuguese leadership to consider more effective means of responding to the transgressive outbreak, namely through the incarceration of offenders in the raspuis and other more drastic measures. The raspuis was the working house at the time. So the house where offenders and people with problems in the city were brought to. Even if such intransigence was reflected in the demultiplication of coercive instruments, by no means would these succeed in counteracting the criminal trend. On the contrary, we observe the increasingly negative impact of transgressions on the general perception of the Portuguese community, particularly among the other nations of Hamburg and the city's state authorities. Caused by the unusual incidence of illicit treatment in the Portuguese community, as well as by a defamatory campaign aimed at amplifying these same transgressions, the serious image problem would put the economic and social life of the community temporarily under suspicion and would inevitably have repercussions on its relationship with the other nations of the city. So to end my talk, I would just like to speak of the approach taken by the communal leaders in relation to the cases, for example, in which shaving with a razor, for example, in other more particular areas, the approach taken by the communal leaders would be a precursor to profound modernizing change. Progressively, secularizing trends would gain ground in the face of ancient customs and traditions. And for example, this was the case, for example, in the shaving with a razor, or even in the approach taken to the subject of branding. Although quite limited in both number and quality, these more liberal attitudes would testify to the strong ties that bound the Portuguese community to the wider Christian world and the European culture of its time. On the other hand, it would demonstrate the needs felt by Portuguese leaders to integrate change and innovation as necessity and indispensable components of the political process. No less important would be the ignorance of the basic precepts of Judaism among a considerable portion of the community's transgressors, or simply the carelessness and neglect of the social and religious norms tacitly shared by the majority of its members. Indeed, in a society where normative Judaism had become the norm in little more than 2 or 3 generations, and where diverse religious orientations and paths clashed strongly, it was more urgent than ever to promote a common reference of fundamental values and principles, and to punish appropriately all those who deviated from the norms established in the community leadership. In this respect, the foundations and practices enforced in the Portuguese community of Hamburg did not differ particularly from those in use in other Western Sephardic communities. As in these, the appropriation of the Iberian heritage as a mark of social distinction, economic success, and collective pride served as a response to the religious and cultural divisions existing in their environment, reinforcing their sense of belonging and group solidarity. Indeed, only in this way could the Portuguese community ensure over several generations the maintenance of the confessional barriers between the majority of its members and the surrounding Christian society. So I will be open now to any questions that you may have about my talk, and I hope to have a very fruitful conversation in the next minutes.
Yes, thank you, Hugo. First question, what language is your book in?
So my book is in Portuguese, which is a problem for a lot of readers. I intend to publish a second book, very similar to this one, so possibly translation with some more details of my recent my more recent work. But I'm thinking of translation in the next year or two. But my book is written all in Portuguese.
Mm-hmm. Then someone asked, can you share the table of contents for your book?
Yes, of course, I can share. Do you want me to put here in the chat box? Yes. Or just to speak them out loud?
We can put it on our Patreon page, I think.
Okay.
David?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If you just send that to us, we'll put it on the Patreon page.
So, okay. Then there's a question from Ali. Are there any surviving records of birth, death, and marriage?
Yes, there are. There are indeed. We have for the 17th century, which is a period in which we have less sources. We have, if I'm not mistaken, a death register, so the register of deaths, and also of marriages. I'm not sure about that, but I think there is for 5 or 10 years also for marriages, but I'm not so sure about this last one. For the remaining centuries, 18th century and 19th centuries, there is much more information about that. So one can easily find information about birth and death marriages and death registers for a time which is not only for 10 or 5 years, but much longer.
Mm-hmm.
Where are these records?
The records are all in the state archive of Hamburg.
Yeah.
So very easily one can have access to all these records. Unfortunately, they are not available in the internet, such as, for example, the archives of the Amsterdam community. However, I think it is the point, the objective of the persons in charge of the archive to bring all these archives to be digitalized in the next years, so that anyone can have access to them.
Yeah, you were mentioning sort of other sources, such as sort of non-Jewish sources, such as the 2 courts. Could you sort of just give us an insight into, perhaps as genealogists, where we should be looking, for example, for whether there are court records, tax, property, wills, testamentos, diplomatic correspondence, and so forth.
So there are these two books, which are the protocol books, which a big part of my work was based on.
Yes.
And besides these two books, there is very little, to put it bluntly. We have, for example, some Christian sources, of course. These sources are, for example, in the Ministerium, which is an archive of the Lutheran Church. They speak about, for example, the various conflicts between the Ministerium and the Senate of Hamburg in dealing with the Portuguese. So these are indirect sources. They are not exactly telling us anything about the Portuguese community, but only its relationship with local authorities. About Portuguese in concrete, these other sources, we have sources from the Niedergericht and Obergericht, which were all burned, but in the big fire of Hamburg in the 19th century. But there is an exception, which is these sources were included in the archives of the, sorry, now I'm not recalling, in the archives of the legal processes of the Holy Roman of the German Empire. So what I mean by this is the two main courts, which is the Imperial Chamber Court, which is the main one. This court, for example, in its processes, it includes the decisions of the Imperial Chamber Court and also the decisions of the lesser courts, the courts before. Of first instance, of second instance, as are, for example, the cases of the Niedergericht and Obergericht. And what we find is that there are a lot of Portuguese businessmen, Portuguese, Spanish businessmen in these processes, in these cases. And normally these are cases of commercial character. So, and commercial and international character. So, for example, cases of marine insurance that go from Portugal and Spain, ports in Portugal and Spain, and also with Hamburg. And they all relate to issues above a certain degree of financial importance. So, if I could guess, the number of these sources would be in the 50s. So there are around 50 processes, I think, around that, between 40 and 50 with Portuguese businessmen. They can be, the summary of these processes can be seen in the internet, because this information can be accessed in the internet. Although, of course, the sources are not, so one would also need to access the sources for this. So there is not much information about the Portuguese in the 17th century for a genealogical study. The biggest source of information would still be the protocol book, which is very good, because there is always reference to the son of, the husband of, the nephew of. So this would help a lot.
Yeah. Might there be information in Danish archives? The Danish archives might also help. I myself am still in the process of trying to find sources. I know that some of these sources might exist. If I'm not mistaken, there were sources cited by Callenbenz. At his time. I'm not so sure exactly where they are, if they are still at the same place. In some cases, if they exist at all. Why do I say this? Because there are indications that some sources that he cited don't exist.
which is a problem. Not many sources, but some sources, and this could also be a problem to the sources in Denmark. However, the connection between the Portuguese and Denmark was mainly through the satellite community of Lupstadt, which was a small satellite community in the vicinity of Hamburg, community of Portuguese Jews. And this community was not inside Hamburg, and was exactly because of that its members were subjects of the Danish crown. But I'm still in the process of finding these sources. If they exist or not, I will certainly try to know that in the following months and years.
Thank you. But Bernard, you have a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a fascinating talk. And for me, it was really exciting because in the list of Mohammeds that you read out, the only name for which I don't have family members for that period was Rothschild. But I was going to ask you about both Glückstadt and also about the Danish Crown archives in relation to the Teixeira funding, because I'm assuming that the Danish Crown's financial records will have been fairly well kept, and that there might therefore well be sources. I'm hoping to go to Denmark in the summer and to do some work in the National Library and possibly the Jewish Library, and was hoping to visit Glückstadt, although I'm not sure that there is a lot from that period, but I will certainly be interested in finding out. I did have a couple of questions. You talked about this 15-year relatively democratic period that ended in 1777.
Yes.
And I have to thank you for your general overall coverage for the kind of social issues and the question of women's position in the society. But can you just say a few words on what happened after 1677, and also whether or not that contributed to the decline of that community? And I have a second question, which is, it's about the order in which Jews arrived in Hamburg and the Hamburg area. For example, the Namjash family, who were all doctors, and who were doctors to the Queen of Sweden and the King of Denmark, among others. And they seem to have been there fairly early. Was there some kind of pattern of a small group of Jews, possibly professionals, establishing themselves and being followed by commercial interests, or did the commercial interests come and then they were followed by professionals? Because I don't have a clear picture on that, but perhaps you do.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for finding the interest in my talk. Indeed, concerning the issue about the democratization and oligarchy, what I found was that you cannot exactly pinpoint which period was the worst in terms of social and economic development in relation to the political state of the community. Why is this? Because there are simply too many factors to consider. If I could guess, but this is a very with a lot of problems. I think that since the beginning, and not after after the period in 1677. If I could guess, since the beginning, this community was always plagued by a lot of problems, and these problems just compounded over time. And I think they are due to a lot of important things that, for example, which I spoke about, but can be also attributed to the lack of a strong middle class. And this, for example, simply didn't existed here in Hamburg. What we see, for example, when we go to the fiscal registers of the community, is that we find one family, which is a Teixeira, paying what seemed to be, for the time, absolutely ridiculous amount of taxes. And it makes sense, because it was one of the most one of the richest of early modern Europe at the time, followed by the Curiel and by 2 or 3 other families. But then we have an enormous gap between these families and the others. So, for example, we can see that the first ones are paying around 200 Reichstaler or something like that, and then the gap goes from 200 to 20 or to 30. So this gap is very big and explains a lot, I think, of the problems that this community had, and probably also the positioning between the most the opposing forces between the most wealthy individuals and families and all the others, in terms of their position in this situation of democratic or oligarchic. What I found in this community was that the period that coincides with the reintroduction of oligarchy was a period that saw, for example, the reintroduction of the oligarchy came about when there was a vote in the community, and this vote was made by ballots, and so in that same year there was a problem, because the ballots were red or black, and the other faction, or the other political faction, did not want. The ballots were all of the same color, and the other faction did not want them to be colorless, because they thought it could be fraud involved. So they asked for specifically black and red ballots. And in this vote, the democracy was still maintained, but 2 months later, the Curiel family and the Teixeira family, how to say, they convinced most of the community, we don't know how, to support them. So the community was for 15 years together backing the decisions of the Milano and of the Lima families, and from one moment to the other, they granted sufficient support to have a general vote. And in this general vote, what happened was that a majority wanted to go the way of that it was before, so non-democratically. But I cannot pinpoint exactly if this was best or worse for the community. It's not really possible to do this. Regarding your second question, it's a very interesting question about who came first and why, and if the community was just a response of a group came in the following the response of a small group of professional doctors. So, for example, you have the Nemias, the Castro, which was already in that time very influential family in the city of Hamburg, because one of its members had been very instrumental in saving the city from the plague in 1597. So he was considered something of a hero at the time because of that, exactly. And he was not seen as being a Jew. He was still outwardly, at least, Catholic. and I would say that there is no indications that anything could be different from that in terms of what he professed, because only after 1605-04 we start to see the first inputs to from very determined families, for example the Lima families, for example the Milano families, to effectively change their faith and start being Jewish and presenting themselves as such. So yes, I think that this initial part of this initial time of the community, we have very few sources, and we don't have much information about what happened, and this is why it's a little bit mysterious still. It's not easy exactly to know who came first, why. What we know is that after the siege in Antwerp in 1585, from the Spanish from the Spanish, what we find is that a lot of new Christians just fled and went to Amsterdam, and some of these also went to Hamburg. Okay, but there is also a lot of information that attests to the arrival of Portuguese Jews directly from the Iberian Peninsula. So these were the two main focuses, the two main origin areas. We don't have much more information about that.
Thank you.
Few more questions in chat. How big was the Hamburg community? What was its average size during the period?
Fairly small. The Hamburg community was counted no more than 800 individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Some say 1,000, some say even 1,200, but I would put my numbers around the 800.
A question from Francis. How did the resistance, objections, and transigence manifest? What were the transgressions?
The transgressions were religious in character. So it could be, for example, in terms of the non-observance of religious precepts. Mm-hmm. They could be ethical, for example, in terms of the moral non-suitedness of, for example, the women that the women or the woman that was serving at the ritual bath. She could be seen as not being proper to accompany the women inside the ritual bath. Or they could also be sexual in terms of for example, men committing and women committing also the moral transgression of I'm not recalling the name of the transgression. To impregnate a married woman, okay, adultery. So this was also a problem, but they could be also economic. This is also very important, because in terms of what counts as economic transgression, there were statutes, and if these statutes were broken, the leaders of the community would impose a sanction. It could be a monetary sanction. It could be this a little bit more rare physical sanction. They could be fiscal also. So if they didn't pay their taxes. So in short, it could be anything that was considered in the statutes and that was not met. It could be economic, ethical in nature. It could be religious. It could also be social. If, for example, a man was violent towards his wife. And it could also be towards outsiders, foreigners.
And those that were punished and ended up in the house, do we know their names?
Yes, not all their names, but some. The majority of those that were punished, we know their names. And in my work, I speak about that, about the most transgressed, the families that figure among the most transgressed individuals.
One of the fascinating aspects of the Amsterdam archives are the lists of despachos, those who were sent away from the community to settle elsewhere. Are there similar lists from Hamburg?
Yes, there are not lists. So we have one or some cases of despachados or despachos. I think there are in total much less than in Amsterdam, of course, but we find them. Not often, but we find them. What we find also is tentative to for example, that there is at one certain point in the community, there is a preoccupation in spending less money with social assistance. And what this does is that people become more, the responsibility of helping your next one was transferred to the family. And with this came also the responsibility to say to the leaders of the community who was not doing what was expected of him, and when these persons were not doing what was expected of them, they mostly ended up being shipped outside the community to the Caribbean. This happened a lot for disciplinary reasons, but also, of course, due to financial reasons.
Yes. You mentioned that the Jewish legal system worked together with the Hamburg general legal system. Was there
Yes.
a kind of, how do you say, which law did prevail in the end? I assume it was civil law.
Oh, it was local law, of course. It was local law. What I mean by this is that eventually, if there was a complaint, if there was a tentative to revert some decision, what was important was, of course, the local law. It was always the one that had supremacy over the Portuguese law. However, what we see is that, exactly as I said, the Portuguese court, and when I say court, I mean there were many courts in the community. There was the Betin, okay, there was the Mahamat court, and then there was the arbitration court. So arbitration is not exactly a court; it's just arbitration. So it's just it's
non-binding.
Yes, exactly. And so what I'm speaking about when I speak about the communal courts, I'm speaking only about Mahamat court, which is a specific court which can detour himself from the religious law if necessary, which can also judge according to the laws of the land, which is something that I was not. It was a shock for me, quite frankly, to see that the community could judge according to the local law, but it was true. It could do this, and when it did, normally it did for cases that presented Portuguese Jews with international merchants, non-Portuguese Jews in Hamburg. So, for example, a Portuguese Jew with a Dutch, or a Portuguese Jew with an English merchant adventurer, or some other non-Portuguese in the court. And so it's very interesting, because what we see from these cases is that it was the goals of that international merchant were accepted by the Portuguese court, which was to be judged according to the laws of the land, which he knew, and not from the laws of the Portuguese Jews, which would be or biased against him, or would not, of course, be of good use to him.
Any questions on YouTube, David?
A couple. Perhaps I should ask them together. One is asking about name changes, which I've never heard of. So it's suggested, for example, that Moreno might become Brown. Somebody previously tried to persuade me that their Birnbaum family was actually Pereira, and therefore they should apply for Portuguese citizenship. And also probably quite a cheeky question. And of course, famously, somebody recently was claiming that the Abramovich,
yes.
A version of Abarbanel. Can we ask first of all about if there were such name changes, and secondly, out of curiosity, if you found any connections with Eastern Europe? I mean, maybe there really was a Abarbanel family in Lithuania.
Yes. So about the Abramovich case, which was very interesting, and of course, it's interesting to us all historians to be also living in the present, not only in the past. This case was very interesting because it basically presented a case of a misuse of nationality law, of course, according to what I know of the case. Possible fraud or illicit enrichment, I don't know. But the idea is that in effect, what happened was that they granted nationality rights in exchange for apparently large sums of money, and that after this happens, the amendments, there was an amendment in the legislation which may have solved the problems of the initial legislation, which had a problem. That is, it did not oblige a technical and professional supervision of the genealogical proofs. I think it's good now as it is. Probably we will see about that in the future. About the Abarbanel, I haven't seen anything that supports the idea that Abarbanel existed in Lithuania. Haven't found anything in that regard. I don't think it's probable. But again, I don't know the proofs that were presented, so I cannot speak about that.
What about more generally, though? Because there's another question here about Inquisition records, and using the Inquisition records, Ton discovered a sort of small community or settlement for a period of time in Danzig, in Gdansk. In the Hamburg records, have you found, because presumably there must have been some, I'm guessing, some trade with, I don't know if there were still the Hansa ports by that period, but certainly with the Baltic region.
Yes, there was. I did not find evidence of trade. What I found was evidence of contact. So there was contact with the community of Danzig, which in turn contacted the Portuguese community, and mostly for financial help and situations of extreme necessity, for example, owing to wars, or I don't know if it was exactly the case, or for example, military or rebel insurgents, something like this. But yes, there were contacts.
Excellent, thank you.
Kahan had a question. What was the interchange between Hamburg and Amsterdam communities that most surprised you?
Mm-hmm. The one that most surprised me was a decision from, a call for a decision from the Portuguese Parnasim in Hamburg to the Parnasim in Amsterdam to revert a decision, a judicial decision in favor of a member of the Curiel family, because he said it was the right thing to do. It was interesting to me to see that, because it spoke about, of course, the possibility of the well-to-do to be biased, or at least to be to have prerogatives and privileges that the others don't have. This was an interesting point, but I would say the contacts between the Amsterdam community and the Hamburg community are constant. They are always happening, and they are happening for various reasons. They are happening for judicial decisions, for example, that have to be passed in tandem. So when they are passed in Amsterdam, then they are passed in Hamburg for the same person, or when they are passed in Hamburg, they are also passed in Amsterdam. So this communication is fundamental for that. Communication also for political reasons. So of course, they all knew each other very well in terms of the leaders of one community and the leaders of the other community. This was good because they could, for example, also lobby in tandem, okay, for certain interests of the Portuguese nation. But the most important was, of course, the conservation of the Portuguese presence in Hamburg and in Amsterdam. So it was always the decisions and the communications that they passed amongst themselves were always with the assumed intention of preserving the Portuguese presence there. and so this was the main thing. But certainly the one that most shocked or interested me as an historian was that one, because it was the contradiction of the statutes, which prohibit that, and also the contradiction of the words of the Muhammad when it wanted to apply justice with integrity and with utmost transparency. So this was a funny thing to see.
Mm-hmm. Yes. David, any more questions on YouTube?
No, there is one actually from Bernard here asking if Hugo has any idea about the origin of the Hamburger, the Jewish Hamburger surname. He's saying that both his Sephardic and Ashkenazi sides have it. Actually, I mean, me too. I remember once telling my late father that one of the Mendozas married a Hamburger, and he said they all did. So, but anyway,
which name exactly?
About the name.
Which name exactly?
Hamburger.
Hamburger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, it must have been sort of adopted by Jews. Do you have any idea when that might be?
I know that, for example, a local Hamburger, I don't know, but I know that a local name started to be also, so a local German name, not started to be a Portuguese name when there was a mixed marriage, yeah, which was Kaiser. But I don't know of any other local name that could have also assumed that could have gone that way too. I'm not sure about that.
Would maybe not a question for you, but would Ashkenazim have had surnames before Napoleon arrived? I don't know.
If
Ashkenazim had surnames before Napoleon and the French imposed them, this is maybe a question for an Ashkenazi person rather.
I really don't know that.
Yeah.
I could not tell.
Okay, well, thank you, and obviously thank you for taking an interest in our community as well. Ton, would you like to close?
Well, thank you, Hugo, for a lively talk.
Thank you.
For the lots of information that you gave to us. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible. We thank our viewers on YouTube. And we hope to see you next week again, when we will interview the new professor of Jewish Studies in Holland, Bart Wallet. Hope to see you all.
Thank you very much, and have a